inviting me and your colleagues at Crescent Kerno to give this talk this afternoon. And thanks to everyone who has tuned in. I would like, if I may, to mention 3 or 4 people: Tim Kellett, Henrietta Boakes, Carolyn Shapiro, and Chloe herself, for leading me gingerly into the mysteries of PowerPoint and Zoom. This is my first attempt, and I'm very, very apprehensive. So we hope the technology and indeed the speaker don't let us down. People who come to Falmouth for the first time are often surprised to discover that there was a thriving Jewish community, small but thriving, from the middle of the 18th century, say, which is 280 years ago. I certainly was in the category of being surprised when I was introduced to the fact. So the first part of the talk will be devoted to discovering what attracted foreign Jews to Falmouth and to Cornwall generally. What sort of reception did they receive when they arrived? Where did they come from? What did they do when they got here? The principal physical remains as evidence of their occupation are the Jewish cemetery itself, and also an historic synagogue, which was obviously at the heart of Jewish spiritual life. The synagogue still exists, although not as a synagogue. It's been converted to housing. And the cemetery we can regard as a precious archive in keeping with the theme of these talks. We will get through the family histories an insight into a long-lost community and a long-lost time. Then we'll conclude the talk with some interesting, I hope, and exciting news about the project that we're putting together to conserve, restore, and ultimately present to the public this cemetery and the adjoining dissenters' burying ground in Ponsharden. We can only do so by virtue of a very generous grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, as well as money from several other institutional funders and private individuals, without whom we couldn't have been embarking on this project at all. So in anticipation, let me thank them all for their generosity. I know that reference to historic England could be controversial. I don't intend any controversy. The question may be asked, why historic England, why not historic Cornwall? I'm not taking sides. I'm dealing with the situation as it is. They have been immensely helpful to us in this project, not only by devoting money, but by scheduling the 2 cemeteries in 2002. So both cemeteries can now comprise a scheduled monument, which offers a layer of protection. And at the same time, the 2 oldest headstones in the Jewish cemetery, I'm sorry, I've jumped ahead, the 2 oldest monuments in the Jewish cemetery are listed grade 2. And then in 2009, the cemeteries were placed on the Heritage at Risk register, none of which guarantees that they're going to be free from further vandalism from which they've suffered. In 2018, Historic England ran a campaign, A History of England in 100 Places. They divided the country into 10 categories and invited the public to nominate their most irreplaceable place in each, or in one of the 10 categories. There were 10 places devoted to each. And in the faith and belief category, the historic Jewish cemetery at Ponsharden has a place. So that puts us on a par with such well-known places as Stonehenge, Holy Island of Lindisfarne, Brick Lane Mosque, Fountains Abbey, and the like. So we're in very good company. In making the award, the chairman, or was he the chief executive? He was the chief executive of historic England said they tell us about dissent. That is to say, the places in the faith and belief category. They tell us about dissent, conflict, tolerance, and kinship between believers, as well as how the practice of faith has influenced and been influenced by the landscape. They show how England has a long history of people of different faiths leaving their mark in a legacy of special buildings and places which still make a strong spiritual contribution today. Now, in preparing this talk, I've relied heavily on one particular book, The Jews of Cornwall, A History by Keith Pearce of Penzance, who I'm proud to say is a friend of mine. He published it in 2014, and it comprises over 30 years of painstaking research. And I think it's no exaggeration to say that between these covers, everything that is known about the historic Jewish community from the 1740s to the present day is recorded. Here's a picture of Keith and Mandy taken at an open day some years ago, 2017. They're unable to be here this afternoon. I know they would have wished to, but they send their best wishes. People in Falmouth may be familiar with ultra-Orthodox Jewish families who, during the summer months, often pay a visit while they're on holiday. And in 2019, a group made special arrangements to inspect the Jewish cemetery. And here they are looking at Keith Pearce's book, which is helping them to identify particular gravestones. They then went on to recite the mourner's Kaddish, the prayer for the dead. Jews have been living in England since Roman and Anglo-Saxon times, in fact, but they were forced to endure increasing levels of persecution down the centuries, until in the 13th century, 1219, they were banished altogether by King Edward I, whose portrait you see on the left of the screen. His motives were partly financial. England was short of money, fancy that. Once banished, the Jews' possessions became the property of the crown. England was the first country to expel Jews, and they remained banned from England for 366 years, until they were eventually readmitted in 1656. And this was because they received the implicit permission of Oliver Cromwell, whose portrait is on the right, Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. He'd shown himself inclined to the question of readmitting the Jews, because he was influenced by the advocacy of one Rabbi Menace Ben Israel, whose sketch portrait by Rembrandt, dated 1636, I believe you see here. He was a respected scholar and a highly regarded rabbi, and visited London personally to present a petition on behalf of what he termed the Hebrew nation. Cromwell was persuaded of the financial benefit that the return of the Jews would bring to the country, and for a time, England became one of the most religiously tolerant countries in Europe. Now, during the 18th and 19th century, there were small but viable Jewish communities in Cornwall, principally Falmouth, Truro, and Penzance, but also elsewhere. The thriving seaports of the southwest attracted Jewish traders, particularly Falmouth, with its international maritime trade, its deep water harbor, and also a flourishing economic hinterland, fishing, agriculture, and hard rock mining. And Jews were welcomed, even encouraged to settle here. Their trading skills, their linguistic abilities were distinct advantages in this cosmopolitan town. We're looking now at the trade card of one member of the Jacob family, Moss Jacob. It's dated about 1864. And if you read, you can get an impression of the wide range of economic activities in which most of the Jewish families were involved. In this case, it's watchmaker, jeweler, etc., musical instruments, and photographic establishment, but they were also money changers And in the four corners of this card, you can see 4 European languages represented, testifying to their linguistic ability. And this sort of spread of activities was, I think, replicated by most of the other Jewish families who lived in Falmouth. We'll look in some detail presently at the Jacob family, but for the time being, here are a couple of portraits which I took from Keith Pierce's book, and they came from the Jacob archives. On the left, we see Moss Jacob himself, he of the trade card, and his wife, Frances Emmanuel. The Jews who came here were part of a much wider migration from the continent. And it's probably true to say that the 2 decades between 1820 and 1840 represent the high watermark of Jewish presence in Falmouth. But even so, there were no more than a dozen families, say 50 to 60 individuals, including children. The same was true of Penzance, with smaller communities in other towns. So we need to ask why they left their various homelands and came to Cornwall. Most were no doubt escaping persecution, discrimination, and the lack of opportunity. But what was worse, there were pogroms. These were organized massacres. The Jews were forced to live in ghettos in the cities, or if they were living in the countryside, they were in strictly delineated areas. They were barred from owning property, practicing most professions and trades, so they grasped any opportunity to escape to a better life if it came along. Britain, as a comparatively tolerant Protestant country with no history of ghettos, offered the Jews opportunities to settle and ply their trades. The rapidly expanding economy during the early years of the Industrial Revolution afforded all sorts of economic opportunities. As we know, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, Cornwall was the richest county in the kingdom. Most of the Jews who settled here had arrived at Harwich and traveled through London to the southwest. And the people who came to this part of the world originated in Alsace, the Netherlands, and Germany, particularly the Rhineland. Here we have a beautiful long case clock made by Henry Harris of Truro. The occupations practiced by the Jews tended to be portable. They were relatively easy to re-establish should the need to move on occur again. So the examples include general merchant, jeweler, silversmith, watch and clockmaker, and tailor. And in Cornwall, particularly Falmouth, Jews established themselves to the extent that they set up and even ran important civic and private societies, such as the Freemasons. This superb example of a clock is by Henry Harris, who was a member of a prominent Cornish Jewish family. He was born in Penzance, moved to Truro, and later to Islington in London. The family was originally from Germany and settled in Cornwall in the mid to late 1700s. Henry's father was also a watchmaker. He was in the Falmouth High Street, and both Henry's parents are buried in the cemetery. He traded from Lemon Street in Truro and held a royal warrant as jeweler to King William IV and Queen Victoria. And I'm very grateful to Anthony Phillips, who I'm pleased to see is here today, the present owner of this clock, for allowing me to photograph it some years ago before he moved from his home in Flushing to Oxford. In the later part of the 19th century, the economy of Falmouth, which had once been so buoyant, began to decline, and as it did so the Jewish population dwindled. By 1880, the synagogue that they built on Smithick Hill, overlooking the harbour, had closed its doors. This lovely Georgian-style building still stands, but has been converted to domestic use, as I mentioned earlier. However, some of its sacred objects found their way into the Royal Institution of Cornwall, including 4 precious Torah scrolls. After closure in 1880, the building was sold, I think in 1892, if memory serves. And in 1999, something quite unanticipated happened. The small Jewish community of Cornwall was reborn. It was called Kehilat Kerno, meaning Cornwall community, which has since developed into a vibrant presence in the county. And this led the Royal Institution of Cornwall, in an unprecedented gesture, to return a Torah scroll used previously in this very building to the present community for use in its services and for safekeeping. Thus it is that a scroll, which was written by a scribe in German Bohemia, now the Czech Republic near Prague, about 350 years ago, taken to Hamburg and then brought to Falmouth around 1740, conceivably by Zender Falmouth, the founder of the community himself, is now once again being used. In this photograph, you see His Royal Highness, the Duke of Gloucester, on behalf of the Royal Cornwall Institution, formally presenting the Torah Scroll to Harvey Kurtzfield. Harvey is founder, past chairman, and presently the lifetime president of Kehilat Kerno. There are now 2 Torah scrolls in the safekeeping of Kehilat Kerno, wrapped up in their new mantles and housed in a portable ark. There isn't a synagogue, so services are held in various different destinations, and a portable ark is the best way of transporting the precious scrolls of the law. As to the question of a Jewish cemetery for Falmouth, this is a copy of a formal request, courtesy of Crescent Kerno, on behalf of Alexander Moses, described here as Moses, a Jew. He's asking for 50 square feet of land for a Jewish burial ground. This was in 1759, and you may think that 50 square feet isn't much land to ask for. I don't know how many people you could sensibly bury. Anyway, the request was apparently declined. But subsequently, permission was granted, and the detail in this map, which is also courtesy of Crescent Kerno, as are the next 2 as well. In this 1788 map, you can see the Jews' burial ground as it's described in its current position, but before the establishment of the dissenters' burying ground, which didn't happen until 1808. This detail is from the Duke of Leeds map. In this detail from a map of 1814, you now see the dissenters' burying ground alongside the Jewish, very clearly marked. The land had been leased to both communities by Sir Francis Bassett, Lord de Dunstanville. The Jewish cemetery is thought to contain about 60 graves, some unmarked. Much larger numbers are in the dissenters, but also we cannot be too sure of the precise number. Tom Weller and Rob Nunn in their book report that there are 585 recorded burial registers, but they obviously didn't all have monuments, so hadn't all been discovered. Now we fast forward to 1880, and in this map, you see the 2 burial grounds described as burial ground. They're not distinguished. But what is interesting is a fascinating detail in the northwest corner where a standing building is depicted, which is clearly the ohel or the tehorah, where the body was prepared for Jewish burial. And on the opposite end, in the northeast, you see a flight of steps coming up from the Turnpike Road, which still exist, and a building which remains in ruinous form but is still there. The Ohel, or the Tehorah, in the case of the Jewish mortuary chapel, no longer exists. One of the world's best-selling and certainly best-loved children's authors and illustrators visited Falmouth in 1892, aged 26, the same year in which this photograph was taken. And she left an interesting description of the Jewish cemetery. Interesting, though unfortunately marred by some historical inaccuracy as well as an anti-Semitic slur. Here's a transcription. So she gives a good description of the access, although she says that the arched gate is to the Jewish cemetery, whereas we know it's not, it's to the dissenters. And where she speaks about the Phoenicians and the Jews cheating in tin, well, the Phoenicians and the Jews certainly weren't here at the same time. If the Phoenicians were here at all, and that there's no historical proof of that, the Jews wouldn't have arrived till the middle of the 18th century, so they weren't at all together. But nevertheless, it's an interesting historical account. We'll focus on the cemetery now. In the entire United Kingdom, there are only about 25 surviving Jewish burial grounds that predate the early 19th century. And 7 of these are in the southwest, so that's disproportionate. They were encouraged, the ones who came to Falmouth in around 1740, by one Alexander Moses, known as Zender Falmouth. Zender being a contraction of Alexander, Falmouth obviously being the place name which he adopted as his surname. His late 18th century headstone, which you see here, though not the oldest in the cemetery, is fortunately in wonderful condition. And this is one of the 2 that's been given special listing by Historic England, as I mentioned earlier. Zender Falmouth's wife, Phoebe Fletcher, her headstone appears pristine, and this is because it was overlain by another fallen headstone and protected from the ravages of the climate. So it looks pristine, almost as clear as the day it was cut. Here you see Paul Ewell, who I think is among us today, who is a 7th generation descendant of Zender Falmouth, paying homage at his grave last year on a visit to Falmouth. Paul recently published a book of his family's genealogy, which he entitled A Short History from circa 1700 to 1961. We'll encounter another branch of Zender Falmouth's family, who now live in Jerusalem, and were the very first to establish direct lineal descent back to Zender Falmouth himself. Well, if Zender Falmouth's was not the first headstone, this is the oldest surviving headstone in the cemetery, possibly in all of Cornwall, and it's thought to belong to one Esther Eliezer, who died in the late 1780s. Uniquely, it's made of granite. All the rest are limestone or slate. Very, very hard and unforgiving material to inscribe clearly, so it's not surprising that the inscription is no longer decipherable. There probably are earlier burials than Esther Eliezer's, but in unmarked graves. If Esther Eliezer's was the first, then this is the last. Nathan Foss, 1833 to 1913. The last burial took place after the Jews had left town and the cemetery had been closed, and it was reopened especially to allow the internment of Nathan Foss, a Falmouth resident. Now this and the following 4 slides were kindly provided to me by Patrick Thompson, the great-great-grandson of Nathan Foss himself. Patrick had been born and raised in Falmouth, but left and returned on a visit in 2006, and for the first time went to see his forebear's grave and took this photograph. At that time, the headstone was standing and intact, as you can see. Here's a detail of the inscription in which, interestingly, there is more English than Hebrew. We're very fortunate to have this record because this is how it appears today. And before lockdown, Patrick was intending to pay another visit to Ponsharden, and we'd made all the arrangements. But I was trying to work out how to give him the news of the wanton destruction that had taken place sometime between 2006, when he took his photograph, and 2010, when there was another photograph. It was smashed into fragments by vandals. Might be reparable, although it looks beyond repair. And when I conveyed the sad news to Patrick, he said, "Alas, humanity never fails to disappoint." Nathan Foss was born in the Netherlands in 1833. He lived in South Wales. He was a spectacle maker. In Falmouth, he was a Freemason, a ship's chandler, and an innkeeper. He ran the Greyhound Hotel in Church Street with his wife, Mary Ann. It's conceivable that the figure seen posing at the entrance in this photograph is that of Nathan Foss himself, but there is no proof. Fascinating account of a case that came before the Falmouth Petty Sessions. A customer, one John Goodman, came into the pub and asked for a glass of ale, and Nathan Foss, the landlord, declined to draw. "Well, if you won't draw for me, I will for you," said Mr. Goodman, and he pulled out a gun. But apparently he didn't have a license for this gun, so he was fined 14 shillings, including costs. We've seen this gravestone previously, but since we don't have an image of Zender Falmouth, I can use it to tell you that he belonged to the Moses family, and the other principal families buried in this cemetery include Wolfe, Solomon, Joseph, Levi, and Jacob. And shortly we'll turn attention to the Jacob family, who had a continuous presence of over a century in Falmouth. But to start with Zender, he's thought to have come to Falmouth via London in 1740, aged 25. He originated in Alsace, where he married Phoebe, whose gravestone you also saw. By 1751, he'd become a founder member and warden of the Falmouth Masonic Lodge. He was a silversmith by trade, and he recruited peddlers and hawkers to work for him in return for loans. And in this way, he became responsible for establishing a rudimentary sort of economic system, which sent Jewish tradesmen from Falmouth fanning out into the surrounding villages and towns, expanding opportunities and incomes. And he was connected by marriage to most Falmouth resident Jewish families because he arranged their marriages as well as employing them. A translation of the inscription, a translation from the Hebrew of the inscription on his gravestone gives a good idea of the traditional way of writing these things. Of the various Jewish families buried in this cemetery, I mentioned that the Jacob family is easily the most important, not only to Falmouth itself, but to the whole of Cornwall, in the opinion of Keith Pearce. They were involved in harbour development, shipping, railways, tin mining. This couple's children include Moss Jacob, whose portrait we saw earlier, and his trade card. Both Jacob and Sarah Kate Simmons, his wife, are buried in the cemetery. Their headstones are identified, but unfortunately in damaged condition. He was apparently a competent painter, and a modern source who was possibly a descendant reported in 1960 having discovered in an antique shop in Philadelphia 2 miniature paintings, one a self-portrait by Jacob, another a portrait of his wife, signed and dated by him 1820. They lived in Bell's Court in Falmouth. You see the house at the end of the oak. This photograph was taken in 1939 at the outbreak of the Second World War, and this is how it looked 2 weeks ago or so. Not much changed, except that it's no longer a house, but Beowulf bookshop and pub, which many people may know. This is a good example of the ornate, beautiful Hebrew inscriptions with a little bit of restrained decoration at the top, above the top 2 letters. It's been expertly carved by local craftsmen, presumably Gentiles, using templates. A few of the headstones have the inscription Olver and Sons, Falmo, as this one does. You can see just below the small arches at the top, on the left, Olver and Sons, and on the right, Falmo, the trademark of this family. At least 4 members of the Olver family are buried in the adjoining dissenters' burying ground. Inscriptions on headstones in this cemetery, predating 1838, are exclusively in Hebrew, but after that date, they may also include English, as is this case, the headstone of Esther Falkson, who died in 1863. You may be able to make out at the bottom, in memory of Esther Falkson. In the case of Moss Jacob, who died in 1860, the reverse side of the headstone was used exclusively for English, sacred to the memory of Moss Jacob, son of J. and S.K. Jacob, Falmouth. There's a much more florid inscription in the Hebrew, which is on the other side, a translation of which reads, "Here lies a man upright in generosity. He went in the path of the good. As a righteous man, he walked in peace, and may he repose in his resting place. Moses, the son of Jacob, may his memory be for a blessing. Leader and guide of the holy congregation of Falmouth, he died Tuesday, the 21st of Shivat, and was buried next day, Wednesday, the 22nd, 5620. May his soul be bound up in the bond of eternal life." A familiar name in Falmouth and elsewhere in Cornwall is that of DePass. The DePass family were Marrano Jews who lived in medieval Spain, but outwardly were forced to profess Christianity in order to escape persecution, although secretly they maintained the Jewish faith. Branches of the DePass family dispersed widely, and Alfred Aaron DePass was born in Cape Town and educated in England. The derivation of the DePass name is interesting in itself. It originated as Shalom, meaning peace, which was rendered DePaz in Spain, which was anglicized to DePass in the UK. Alfred Aaron DePass visited Devon and Cornwall while on honeymoon. He returned to Falmouth on holiday with his family in 1895, and he was absolutely smitten with Falmouth. He built a house, Cliff House and moved in with the family in 1897. His immensely wealthy father had accumulated a lot of money through his widespread business interests in South Africa, the principal one of which was guano for use as an agricultural fertilizer. As you may know, guano is seabird and bat droppings, very rich in nitrogen, potassium, and NPK. It'll come to me in a minute, the third element, sorry. Anyway, his wealth enabled the son, Alfred, to retire in his early 30s and dedicate himself to the serious, and some may be tempted to say compulsive, collecting of precious paintings and other works of art. Great wealth and assiduous collecting practices led to this huge collection of priceless art. But it seems that he didn't hang on to what he acquired for very long, because his passion for collecting was matched by great philanthropy, and he made substantial donations, not only in Cornwall, but to other great national galleries in London, Cape Town, Oxford, Plymouth, everywhere, in fact. He made very generous donations to Falmouth Art Gallery. You only need to look on their website to see the extent of his generosity. And his gifts to the Royal Institution in Truro, according to Keith Pearce, amount to no less than 75% of their holdings of fine art. Fortunately, the catholicity of his tastes was matched by his boundless generosity. Now, the reason for including DePass in this presentation isn't because he's buried in this cemetery, but rather because while living in Falmouth, he saved the cemetery from oblivion. The local population had long since left. The cemetery was in a neglected and decrepit state. So he acquired the title to it and employed people to restore and care for it, even after he had left Falmouth to return to South Africa, to Cape Town, to his birthplace. And it's no exaggeration to say that the fact that the cemetery continues to exist today and provide us with a window into this lost community is entirely due to the generosity of one man. After DePass, the cemetery suffered from decades of neglect and more recently, as we've seen, vandalism. But now the two cemeteries that lie side by side in Ponsharden are protected by a security fence generously erected by Sainsbury's. And furthermore, they've at last found a group of local champions. The Friends of the Ponsharden Cemeteries were established in December 2013, comprising local volunteers, representatives of Falmouth Town Council, Kihilat Kerno, and Historic England, working with specialist professionals. We are drawing up plans to repair, protect, and present to the public both of these cemeteries, as I mentioned earlier. And those of you who are local might have noticed driving past the green banner on the gate, which has been boarded up until our work is done, signifying the existence of the Friends of Ponsharden and the fact that a project is underway. The plans are ambitious and will be expensive. So we've also been involving ourselves in fundraising. And we're immensely grateful, as I said right at the beginning, to our principal fundraiser, or to our principal funder, the National Lottery Heritage Fund, also to the other funders, some of whom are listed here, and to the individuals. The total cost of the project is going to be over £500,000. To be precise, £567,548. And the Heritage Fund have agreed a grant of almost £1/3 That's to say £333,100. The remaining funding has also been secured or pledged in cash or non-cash contributions. Most of our funders are listed on this slide. but not to overlook the private individuals, some of whom have relatives buried here and who've contributed cash or time and energy. And to all of our funders, we on the steering committee of the Friends of the Ponsharden Cemeteries express our profoundest gratitude. This is the scope of our restoration project. The detailed funding bid was drawn up with specialist contributions from a team of professional consultants comprising conservation architects, archaeologists, landscape architects, engineers, and quantity surveyors, working under a project manager appointed by and reporting to the two principal clients, who are Falmouth Town Council on the one hand, owners of the Dissenters Burying Ground, and the Board of Deputy of British Jews, owners of the Jewish Cemetery, under the auspices of the Friends of the Ponsharden Cemeteries. Apart from maintenance, the first constructive, if that's the correct term to describe a whole, project that we did was to undertake an archaeological dig to determine whether an intriguing mound in the northwest corner of the Dissenters Cemetery was significant or not. Fortunately, it wasn't, comprising contractor's spoil and the knowledge that we can cut a path through from this spot to join up the Dissenters to the Jewish cemetery is wonderful news, because the present access crosses graves, which is not the right thing to be doing at all. Now, the priority in our project is to make the site safe and secure by restoring the two entrances on the northern bypass road and supporting the overhanging earth bank. The removal of the vegetation has revealed how precarious it is. People might have noticed that driving by. So we have to undertake quite elaborate and expensive engineering work to support that bank. We're also going to repair the perimeter hedges and to plant trees. And there'll be a network of pathways, viewpoints, and interpretation boards. Most importantly, we're going to repair, re-erect, and conserve the vandalized monuments to the extent that that is possible and feasible. I hope that COVID-19 won't delay work on site, which we hope to undertake soon. As an outside project, we'll probably be able to continue once we start in 2 or 3 weeks' time. We've already completed a bat survey and established that there are no roosts on site, and a tree survey. And we'll begin selective tree cutting in mid-February, but only where continued growth threatens further damage to graves. We respect the fact that nature has re-established itself here, and we don't want to discourage that at all. So soon we're hoping to appoint a main contractor to start on site in July and complete by next February. Thereafter, there'll be a year's activity and community engagement with the site accessible to the public, and Falmouth Town Council will play a central role. I would just like to invite you to look at the archaeologist on the right of this picture, Karadok Peters, and his team of students and volunteers. And in the deepest hole on the left-hand side, Brian Ewell, who lives on the Roseland, a retired archaeologist himself, and is another descendant, the brother of Paul Ewell, whom you saw in the beginning, of Zender Falmouth himself. Finally, we'll have a quick glimpse at some of the things that have been going on while all this intricate planning work has been undertaken. In May 2019, Street Draw, organized by artist Helen Travaskis, who is with us this afternoon, whom you see in this photograph, organized local artists and students to spend 24 hours on the streets drawing Falmouth in aid of St. Petrock's work on behalf of the homeless. And then she organized a sale of the works of art. Here you see Helen herself doing a semi-abstract rendition of that beautiful gravestone in the distance, covered in orange and yellow lichen. And I'm very proud to say that I am the owner of that artwork, thanks to Helen's generosity. This is another artist's approach, a freehand transcription of Hebrew lettering from one of the headstones. We've had several school visits. In June 2019, a class of about 20 pupils from Marlborough School, Falmouth, visited, accompanied by their teacher and some parents. They were exceptionally well behaved, and they made tracings of the Hebrew letters on the headstone, which they found very intriguing. Here you see two little girls tracing the lettering on Zender Falmouth's headstone. And you may remember Esther Eliezer, the oldest headstone. Here you see it in the bottom right-hand corner of this view. Catherine Esther Berman of Jerusalem, who's with us this afternoon, is the 7th generation granddaughter of Esther Eliezer. And she is seen here in the center of the group with a red top. As her husband, to her right, Elliot Berman, recites the mourner's Kaddish, special prayer for the dead. Following her visit to Falmouth from Jerusalem, Catherine Berman went on to establish her direct lineal ascent from Zender Falmouth himself, and was the first person to do so. The Ewell family were the second. She also published a book called Stepping Back in Time of her family's history. So it's appropriate to end the talk where we began it, with Zender Falmouth. Thank you all for sitting through this. Much obliged.